Now the problem wasn't isolated to just Ibn Taymiyyah. Some classical scholars, to varying degrees, for example Imam al-Shaybani, and I'm not going to go through all of them, he was a student of Imam Abu Hanifa, argued that it was legitimate for Muslim armies to kill civilians in the course of war, in the form of regrettable collateral damage. Al-Shaybani, for example, approved the use of arrows, lances, flooding, burning with fire, and mangonels, I'm quoting, in situations where women and children would likely be killed. Now, he didn't cite textual evidence for this, but he argued instead that a blanket prohibition on killing non-combatants would make going to war entirely pointless because, to quote, he says, "There is no city in the territory of war in which there is no one at all of these you have mentioned." There's no city where there's no women and children. How can you conduct war at all in this way if you have a blanket prohibition? So there was a reasoning, there was a rational analysis to say this is impossible to do this. So we have to limit that ruling on non-combatants. So there was a trend line during this time. Now what I've emphasized again is this trend line didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a response to specific inter-imperialist rivalry between the Muslim empires and other empires of the time. Writing in the 13th century, Ibn Taymiyyah is arguably the classical scholar whose works in particular have been used and reinterpreted by radical Muslim political activists in the modern era. Specifically, his ideas have been drawn on by people such as Maulana Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, and Abdullah Azzam. Maududi writing from Pakistan, Qutb from Egypt, Abdullah Azzam, he was born in the West Bank of Jordan, but he participated in the Afghan war against the Soviets. Ibn Taymiyyah lived during the conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate, as I said, the conquest by the Mongols. And he was basically, he considered himself, I mean, he was an inspiration to the school of thought we consider to be Salafi, in the sense that he wanted to go back to the Quran and the early Muslims to understand what Islamic thinking was. He didn't necessarily follow the existing traditional schools. But there was no such school of Salafism at the time. It's very important to recognize that. When the Mongols actually converted to Islam, this raised a difficult question at the time of whether it was still legitimate for Egypt's Mamluks to wage a jihad against them. And his answer to this was that the Mongols, by implementing what he called man-made laws, the Yasser code, it was their own tribal code, instead of the Sharia, were in fact living in a state of Jahiliyyah, or pre-Islamic pagan ignorance. So consequently, he argued, jihad against these kind of heretics or apostates was not only allowed, it was obligatory. So 20th century Muslim writers, after Ibn Taymiyyah, Maududi, Qutb and others, they developed their own political theories of Islamic revolution in their own very specific social context, not simply the consolidation of secularism in the West, but more significantly the age of colonization and decolonization, when anti-imperialist struggles for nationalist independence from British, American and European colonial interference were breaking out across the Third World. While Ibn Taymiyyah had extended the idea of Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, to a Muslim leader and the state, these authors extended it further to encompass wholesale Muslim societies as such. Now these ideas are uniquely modern in the sense that they reformulated very specific and arguably marginal strands of classical thought in order to develop a reactionary response to Western forms of political, socio-economic and cultural imperialism, particularly in their own countries, namely Pakistan, Egypt and Afghanistan, etc. Abdullah Azzam in particular, he was Osama bin Laden's mentor and he worked closely with bin Laden in the early years of the Afghan conflict. He drew on the works of Maududi and Qutb to formulate his doctrine of continuous war for a pan-Islamic state. So again, we have to be specific. Maududi and Qutb did not endorse a program of action like Al-Qaeda, but Abdullah Azzam drew on their works to develop his own program of action. So there was an evolution in this thinking. So this brings back to the thorny question of really, well, how the hell do you actually get to understand what is the Islamic perspective, or are we kind of doomed in this very disturbing framework of thinking? Despite their differences of legal opinion, there are actually broad areas of consensus amongst all classical and modern scholars on the methodology of tafsir, interpretation, of the Quran. They all agree, for example, including Ibn Taymiyyah, that the first and foremost source of information on the Quran is the Quran itself. This is very, very crucial, and we'll come back to this. Put simply, the Quran should be read holistically and integrally. You can't just pick a verse on a particular subject, say war, and interpret it by itself, and ignore everything else that is said in the Quran on war. You have to understand that verse in the context of all the other verses in the Quran which deal with that subject. Otherwise, in a sense, you're actually disrespecting the Quran. You're saying, well, I'm not going to look at that, forget everything else. So, all the scholars agree on this, very simple. As Ibn Taymiyyah himself said, quote, in order to understand the Quran, you should first look to the Quran itself. If that doesn't help, then turn to the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the way of the Prophet himself. So in parallel with interpreting the Quran by the Quran itself specifies that for further understanding and clarification, you have to refer to the Prophet. It's therefore incumbent to simultaneously account for the Prophet's own teachings and practices on the subjects under consideration that we're trying to find out about. So these teachings and practices are recorded in historical accounts, which I mentioned before, known as hadith, around which there is also a sophisticated science. Again, some of this may be old news to you, and just in case you're not familiar, I'm going to just roughly go through it. There's a science for determining the authenticity and reliability of these historical reports about the Prophet. And once again, there is a consensus among all scholars, whatever their school of thought, that the vast majority of these historical reports that have come down in these, these hadith collections are spurious. We all know that, Muslims are aware of that. What they do, they disagree on exactly which of these ones are spurious. But concerning those historical reports which are considered reliable, out of these there are still many that different schools of thought dispute, so we argue about that. But, however, there are also among these a broad set of reports which all schools of thought consider to be reliable. I'm very sorry that I'm labouring this point, but it's important that we understand that there is a consensus across all different schools of thought, which is what I'm trying to get at with this presentation. If we really want to understand Islam's approach to political violence, we need to develop an analysis which focuses on interpreting the Quran and the prophetic traditions, collectively and holistically, relates these sources of knowledge to the historical conditions which they were addressing, and is able on this basis to develop an understanding of the underlying principles and values that were consistently applied in these conditions. This process is part of what is known as the maqasid al-Sharia. That's the higher moral principles or philosophical objectives of Sharia. Now, this approach was never predominant in the early years of the evolution of classical Muslim scholarship. It was nevertheless broadly accepted by all the leading schools of thought to differing degrees. The majority of the scholars recognized that the Sharia was supposed to be rational, goal-oriented, and in conformity with these fundamental ethical principles. In this sense, although Ibn Taymiyyah's conclusions were arguably incorrect, his objective was right. Ibn Taymiyyah advocated a return to the Quran and to the prophetic model. The problem is that he didn't correctly understand either of these. I'm going to come back to Robert Crane, who basically is trying to summarize all of the principles that the scholars of the time, the classical scholars, basically derived as a framework of what are the fundamental principles of Islamic thinking. And they're all there. I'm not going to go through them in detail, you can read them for yourselves. But those basically give us a framework for actually looking at some of the other conclusions of the classical scholars and saying, well, there is a body of work in the classical scholarship which actually is in tension with some of the rulings about jihad. So we're not saying jettison the classical scholars, we're saying read them critically, read them with nuance. Don't just read them as if this is you're reading this is not the same thing as what we believe to be divine revelation. So now I'm going to come to the meat of the issue, and we're probably all, I know it's been a while, probably all half dead and bored by now. What is jihad really? Now, okay, jihad is routinely translated in the media as holy war. It's almost a truism to say it doesn't mean war at all. The Quran uses other words to describe war. Qital and harb, for example. Throughout the Quran, the word jihad is used by the Quran in its root meaning, that is, to strive and struggle for self-improvement as well as for the advancement of society. The word jihad occurs about 41 times in the Quran. Not a single verse uses it in the sense of war.